Chapter 15, Depression and Dictatorship. Part 3, The Rise of the Dictators. The attractiveness of the European dictators. While America was thrashing around in the 1930s with different efforts to get the national economy up and moving again, American intellectuals began to challenge the country, to look abroad to systems that seemed to actually be working. American capitalism as an economic idea seemed stone dead. Other national economic systems, however, seemed not to be suffering as badly as America's. Thus, among many Americans, the feeling began to grow that America needed to take a closer look at and possibly take some economic notes on what these dictators were doing. Stalin's communist command economy, or state capitalism. The glamour of communism. Stalin's communist-directed industrial revolution in Russia inspired many of these intellectuals, while America and the capitalist West found their economies stagnant, with factories idle and workers unemployed in massive numbers. Stalin's Russia presented a marvelous picture of rapid industrial development. Hydroelectric dams going up across many broad Russian rivers to bring huge amounts of electricity to Russian society. Steel plants rising everywhere to produce the steel needed for trucks, tractors, etc. Urban housing for the Russian worker going up everywhere, etc. Communism seemed to be proving itself vastly superior to capitalism, which clearly had failed in America, at least as some American intellectuals saw things. The hidden reality of Stalin's unbounded oppression. What these intellectuals could not or would not see was that nothing like Marx's communist utopia was going on in Stalin's communist Russia. The state was hardly withering away. Under Stalin, it had expanded its powers until virtually nothing at all went on in the Soviet Union that did not come under the tight grip of Stalin's police state. Intellectual idealists in America were unable to see the horrible price being paid by the Soviet farmer to enable this amazing industrial building program to go forward in the Soviet Union, because Stalin had terrorized the nation into silence about this part of his great achievement. Farming families were forced to hand over their fields and herds to Soviet authorities as part of Stalin's policy of collectivizing Soviet agriculture. At this point, farmers in this Soviet workers' paradise were considered as simply fellow workers for the Soviet state, much like the workers in the factories, mines, and other industrial operations. But Stalin's treatment of the farmers was brutal in the extreme. He intended to transfer the national wealth of Russia from the countryside to his new industrial cities, and so he simply confiscated the wealth of the countryside to finance his industrial programs. Hoarding of food production was a crime, punishable by death. And if a farmer and his family looked moderately healthy, they did so because they were hoarding, that is, holding back part of their harvest for themselves. That was highly illegal. Thus, many farming families simply took the route of slow starvation. Many others were sent to Siberian work camps for actively resisting this forced collectivization, where they died either along the way or within a few years of arriving at these work camps. In the process, possibly as many as 12 million farmers died to make way for the country's transition from agriculture to modern industry in the period 1930 to 1933. What American intellectuals were not understanding was how much of Stalin's rising industrial state, such as the fabled Magnitogorsk iron works located in the Ural Mountains, producing iron on a massive scale, and massive supporting community built around it, was built by and employed by masses of peasants driven from their farmlands into this new industrial life by Stalin's system of state-manipulated mass starvation. And there was the Norilsk mining and manufacture works, mining nickel, copper, and palladium, and the extensive railway system reaching across a frozen north to bring all this under central command that was built by hundreds of thousands of what were essentially slave laborers. This was in addition to the massive and equally brutal ethnic cleansing of national minorities that Stalin ordered, 250,000 of such individuals. It was also in addition to the deadly purges of the later 1930s that Stalin forced on his own Soviet Communist Party and the Soviet Red Army, because he trusted no organization that he himself had not personally built up. Even people who had once been political allies of his, he had executed. The figures are hard to validate, but they range from about 700,000 to almost 2 million people executed under the orders of Stalin in his purges of the later 1930s, principally 1937 and 1938. Sadly, countless idealistic American intellectuals will continue to extol the virtues of communism, something they would come to regret later, after the end of the coming war, that is, during the early stages of the Cold War of the late 1940s and early 1950s, when communism was at that point seen as the great threat to the existence of democratic America. Fellow Americans would not easily overlook the earlier enthusiasm for communism espoused by such intellectuals. The suspicion would be that once a communist, always a communist, which in most cases would not be true, but in some cases would indeed be true. Hitler's New Order, or Neue Ordnung. Other American intellectuals looked to Hitler's Nazi Germany, beginning in the early 1930s, with its very evident strong rise in power out of the former catastrophe of Germany's Weimar government, a democratic experiment in Germany that seemingly had failed to bring Germany out of the chaos of the times, although actually by the late 1920s, things were working fairly well in Weimar Germany. Although Hitler himself was a coarse man, or at least a leader of a very coarse group of Nazi German toughs, his policies seem to have validated themselves in the way they got Germany back up and moving in strength as society, something that many Americans felt was becoming increasingly beyond the reach of their own country. Hitler knew how to put on a grand show, thanks also to the talents of Goebbels, who had the skills of a major Hollywood producer, at a time when much of the rest of the Western world was languishing in economic pity and spiritual self-doubt. All of Hitler's fascist expansiveness was accompanied by grandiose ritual with massive gatherings of boot-stomping and singing soldiers on parade, torch-lit assemblies with Nazi banners everywhere and searchlights piercing the infinity of the night sky, and, most importantly, Hitler from his podium haranguing the masses with his boasting of German greatness. He also knew how to validate his rule democratically by working the German legislative system, including the massive fire that raged through the German Bundesrat, or parliamentary building, just prior to the 1933 elections, a fire that allowed him to exclude communists from the vote, giving his Nazis the voting edge they needed to stay in power. He would even use general votes, or plebiscites, in which the Germans were instructed to vote in favor or opposition to his programs, carefully chosen and conducted in a manner designed to produce a ridiculously high democratic affirmation of him and his policies. For Americans in love with the idea of democracy, it was impossible to be critical of Hitler's democratic ways. Hitler was actually a despiser of democracy, considering it simply a system by which the weak held back the natural drive of the strong towards greatness. He was very Darwinian in his understanding that nothing should stand in the way of the strong taking control of history to promote the rising greatness of the superior people, that is, the Aryan Germans. He also had problems with Christianity for much the same reason. It focused too much on the problems of the poor and the weak. In its unreformed ways, by German national standards, it was a religion fit only for the poor and the weak, not the strong. Tragically, German Christians, and most importantly, Christian leaders, adjusted their gospel message as German Christians to make it conform more to the Hitlerian agenda. To be sure, the increasingly shrill anti-Jewish ranting of Hitler disturbed many thoughtful Americans, though there was always an undercurrent of anti-Jewish sentiment that also ran through America at this time. Thus, many Americans felt inclined to look the other way when it came to what Hitler was doing to the Jews in Germany during the 1930s. He had removed them from all positions of importance in German society and treated them, even the highly educated, even the highly decorated for their service to Germany in the Great War, as the vilest of Untermenschen, that is, inferior people, unworthy of any sentimental concern on the part of a true Aryan German. And as the 1930s advanced, Hitler increasingly directed his attentions to the programs of demonstrating the power of Nazi ideology on the larger European stage. He rebuilt the German state around his own personal will, rearmed Germany militarily, and began to bully his neighbors in order to make way for German expansion, or Lebensraum, meaning living space or living room, directed particularly eastward in the direction of the Slavic-speaking world, that is, the world of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, etc., where he saw land available by conquest, land whose fields could feed the growing German population, and lands whose minerals could feed the German war machine. Italy's Mussolini. Italian fascism. Mussolini had easily seized national power in 1922, and then undertook political theatrics designed, supposedly, to restore Italian pride, as if the greatness of ancient Rome had been restored. The Italians themselves were not terribly impressed, but they played along with Mussolini and his political band of fascists who paraded around like soldiers, trying to impress the Italians with the seriousness of their fascist agenda. Mussolini and Hitler. Although the Italians themselves were more motivated by family dinners and music offered in the opera style, Italians were indeed great singers, then by Mussolini's military antics, Hitler was taken in by Mussolini's theatrics. Consequently, a partnership developed between Mussolini and Hitler, in which, oddly enough, Hitler seemed to be more the junior partner. Hitler indeed seemed to model much of his own fascist program after Mussolini's. Perhaps this was because by the mid-1930s, Mussolini had already undertaken a program of military expansion in Africa that Hitler was still only dreaming of. In 1936, the two leaders signed a friendship treaty, the Axis Pact. Mussolini claimed that Berlin and Rome formed an axis around which all of Europe would eventually revolve. And in 1937, Germany and Italy and Japan signed a treaty more clearly aligning the countries politically against Stalin's rising Russia and recognizing the right of each of the treaty powers to full dominion in their respective theaters of operation. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia and the West's non-response. Hungering for imperial expansion, Mussolini gathered 300,000 Italian troops in northeast Africa in the Italian colony of Somaliland, with the clear intent of seizing still independent Ethiopia next door. The matter was brought before the League of Nations, which ultimately did nothing, the French and the English not wanting to alienate Mussolini and hoping still to enlist Italy against the threat of a rising Germany. Realizing that he would get no opposition from the Western powers, in October of 1935, Mussolini's troops crossed into Ethiopia to begin a war that would drag on for another 6 years. Italian victory seemed to be in the making when Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie fled and the Ethiopian capital was seized in mid-1936. But the Ethiopian tribesmen would continue to fight on, guerrilla style, against their Italian occupiers until the Italians went home in 1941 to a more serious fight going on in Europe itself. Appearing before the League at the point of the apparent Italian victory, the Ethiopian emperor outlined the pitfalls of failing to answer Mussolini's aggression, warning, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." The League did respond with economic sanctions aimed at Italy, which, however, were really not enforced. In fact, an effort to restrict oil sales to Italy was undercut by American oil industrialists, who were quite willing to keep up oil sales to Mussolini. And the French and the English were discovered to be trying to work out another secret treaty with Italy, recognizing the partition of Ethiopia among the three powers. In fact, the only net result of the League's sanctions was to rally the Italians more strongly behind Mussolini. France and England seemed to have little will to stand up against the rising dictators. France in the 1930s. In February of 1934, the growing antagonisms in France between the political left and the political right, greatly exacerbated by the Stavinsky investment fraud, which implicated many leftist cabinet members, erupted in the form of Paris riots, which many thought was the prelude to an attempt at a right-wing political coup. Order was restored to France. However, left-wing suspicions of an ongoing right-wing fascist plot and similar suspicions by the right of communist plots of the left to take over France split the country into deeply hostile political groupings. Besides the left-right deadlock over the basic political path the country should take, the evolution of the larger world of European politics, especially during the 1930s, made French national politics even more complex. The French could not decide which rising power to the east, Nazi Germany or Communist Russia, posed the greater danger to Western, or at least French civilization. Along with this went wide disagreements on how to respond to Mussolini in Ethiopia and the civil war raging in Spain from 1936 to 1939. In short, France really was not able to get its act together at a time that it was supposed to be one of the two major enforcers of the post-World War I international status quo, the other being, of course, England. Indeed, by the late 1930s, France found itself floundering in a deep domestic political war. The English. The Conservative Party leader Stanley Baldwin dominated English politics during much of the period following the Great War. Baldwin's governance was characterized by a policy of peace at any cost. He understood that the English did not want ever to go to war again, that they expected him to keep them from diplomatic entanglements and any military buildup. This was viewed at the time as what had been largely responsible for the Great War of 1914-1918 in the first place, and therefore his first priority as England's leader was to get England back on sound economic ground. Thus, he cut back tremendously on England's military spending and strength at a time that Germany was rebuilding its military power, happening actually even before Hitler took charge of Germany in 1933, in well-recognized violation of the terms of the Versailles Treaty of 1919 and the Locarno Pact of 1925. Every effort was made by Baldwin and most British politicians and intellectuals to excuse Hitler's moves to remilitarize Germany, on the basis that Germany was only compensating for the horrible injustices inflicted on Germany by the now notorious Versailles Treaty. Footnote. The spirit of total pacifism was so strong in Britain that not only did the British Communist and Labour parties on the left denounce British remilitarization, but also in 1933, the Oxford Union debated the issue of British intervention in the Japanese takeover of Manchuria, producing, with a vote of 275 against 153, a final resolution declaring that this house will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. The resolution became the basis for much debate, not only in Britain, but around the world. Churchill was hugely vocal in his disgust. Thus, Baldwin and Winston Churchill found themselves constantly at odds over this issue of England's pacifism in the face of German remilitarization. Baldwin viewed Churchill as a warmonger who wanted to drag England into an arms race and thus another war with Germany. Churchill viewed Baldwin as one who invited German military adventurism by the obvious lack of English resolve to stop Hitler before he became so strong that there would be no way to block his military ambitions. Basically, Baldwin was working out of the spirit of the moment, of the times that he lived in. Churchill was working out of a longer sense of British history and its long-standing role as balancer of power on the European continent, as, for instance, in the days of Napoleon in the early 1800s. History would soon be the judge of which of the two had it right. Chamberlain's appeasement policy. Then, in May of 1937, an exhausted Stanley Baldwin stepped down, and the new Conservative Party leader, Neville Chamberlain, became English Prime Minister. Whereas Baldwin had been a pacifist, Chamberlain was actually rather pro-German. As the 1930s developed, it appeared that England too was facing a choice of which of the two growing military powers to the east, Communist Russia or Nazi Germany, was the greater threat to the peace of Europe, and thus also the world. Chamberlain took the view that it was the Russian communists that posed the greater danger, and a policy of appeasing Germany's Hitler and Italy's Mussolini would bring the nations of the West and Central Europe into a broad anti-communist, anti-Russian front. But England and Europe were soon to discover the shortcomings of the appeasement approach to Hitler and his doings. The gathering clouds of war. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Although Spain was a constitutional monarchy, like England and most of the rest of the European continent, the country had actually been run by a system of local bosses, caciques, with little interest in turning Spain into a modern society. Spain itself was highly divided as to the direction it wanted to go, especially after the Great War, which Spain stayed out of, but which benefited a small group of industrial entrepreneurs who sold goods to the combatants. The vast and highly traditional countryside, strongly Roman Catholic and even semi-feudal in mentality, was greatly alienated by the small intrusion of modernity into a society still romantically attached to the glorious past of the 1500s, a past that was very unlikely to ever return. Then there were the new industrial workers who grudgingly took their place in Spain's factories, who felt a bit of kinship with the Russian workers, who similarly had moved abruptly from feudalism to modern industrial society, led by communist idealists, the Bolsheviks. In short, Spain was a confused and highly divided society. Into that confusion stepped Spanish General Primo de Rivera, who seized power in 1923 and forced economic and social discipline on Spain, settling things down a bit and eliminating the caciques, but whose rule gradually began to draw strong criticism from impatient modernizers, who felt that his Mussolini-like grip over Spanish society and the Spanish monarchy that supported him was only serving to block real social progress. Ultimately, both Rivera and King Alfonso, tiring of the situation, in 1931 called for a referendum on Spain's future. The results went in favor of a Republican government, and Rivera stepped down and the king abdicated. But the Republican government's move to secularize Spain's Catholic culture, undercutting the church's role in the country's schooling and cultural disciplines such as its stand on marriage and divorce, served only to deepen the cultural division that split Spain into two hostile groups. The Republicans concentrated heavily in urban Spain, actually bitter about the slowness of the social reforms, and increasingly of a communist or anarchist frame of mind, and the more rural nationalists who clung desperately to a clearly dying traditional Catholic Spain. Back and forth, power swung in the national parliament, the Cortes, until by mid-1936 the battle had moved to the streets in the form of fighting between the two groups. The conservative Phalangists, backed by a very conservative Spanish military, and the proto-communist Republicans, supported by 200,000 asaltos. This was the signal for General Francisco Franco Bahamonde to leave his position in Morocco with accompanying nationalist troops to defend Spain from the leftist Republicans. At this point, the very bloody Spanish Civil War broke out. But this civil war did not actually remain much of a civil war, but instead it turned itself quickly into a test run of the superpowers, especially Germany and Italy, which intervened on Franco's side to try out their new military products and strategies, dive bombers, for instance. Stalin sent a huge number of advisors to help the Republicans against Franco, as did also France and Britain, although only on a very small scale. Volunteers poured in from America, serving on one side or another. Hemingway, for instance, actually serving with the Republicans, building his 1940 novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, on his own experience in the war. Feelings ran very hot on both sides of the war, both sides destroying villages and killing villagers caught in the crossfire, and major atrocities occurred. Leftist Republicans killing priests and raping nuns, and the Nazi allies of Franco leveling the town of Guernica as practice in developing dive-bombing techniques that would later be used by Hitler in his conduct of blitzkrieg. Little by little, Franco's phalangists, with a lot of help from Germans and the Italians, were able to gain ground against the Republicans until in 1939 Madrid was finally taken by Franco and the war came to a halt. Spain was devastated, and it would have presiding over it a dictator determined to shape Spain exactly as he, Franco himself, determined, all the way up until Franco's death decades later, 1975 in fact. Spain was exhausted and in no hurry to get involved in another war. They would indeed sit out World War II. But everything that pointed to the tragedy that was about to break out in Europe was contained in those events of 1936 to 1939. The Spanish Civil War, in fact, was simply a dry run on the larger war that Hitler had planned for Europe. And the responses of all the major players to these events focused on Spain would resemble very closely how the diplomacy and military development would occur as events leading up to World War II. But few understood this at the time, especially the English and the French, who continued to hope that they somehow knew the formulas for keeping the peace in Europe. Spain taught them nothing. Japanese imperialism in Asia. Japan had come to consider itself one of the great world powers as the 20th century got underway, having modernized its army and navy to the point that it was able to defeat Tsarist Russia in a Siberian war fought in 1904 and 1905. Also, although the Great War, 1914 to 1918, was essentially a European war, Japan played a part as an Asian ally of the British and French, and were rewarded accordingly by the formal recognition on the part of those victorious powers of the Japanese takeover of German colonies in the Pacific. America, of course, was very wary of Japanese broader interests in Asia. The Philippines was an American protectorate, defended by a number of American troops posted there. But in general, Japanese-American relations remained somewhat friendly, although the Japanese were insulted by America's 1924 Immigration Act, which greatly reduced the number of immigrants allowed to come to America, virtually excluding all Japanese. But the Japanese were willing to make a move closer to the ideal of democracy supposedly having proved itself the stronger social system in the recent war with autocracy. However, with the onset of the Depression, democracy was not looking so impressive, and the Japanese military group within the Japanese Imperial Cabinet began to take a scornful attitude towards the Japanese pro-democracy civilian politicians who had agreed to internationally determined formulas of naval and military disarmament, the military party pressing instead for a military buildup of both the Army and the Navy. Indeed, radicals within the Japanese military were calling for a revival of Shinto, a somewhat mystical philosophy, stressing the virtue of military valor, or Bushido, even the glory of death in battle. For some, especially the younger Japanese soldiers, Shinto and its Bushido ethic formed for them an intoxicating ideal. By the early 1930s, civilian leaders were being assassinated, and cabinets were being turned over with destabilizing rapidity. Also in 1932, young officers in the Japanese Occupational Army in Manchuria, that is in northeastern China, staged a fake crisis and used the event to simply take full control of the Chinese province and set up a puppet government there. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito did not seem to object, and the civilian government seemed unable to undo the takeover, which was in fact very popular with the Japanese people. Tensions began to mount in the Chinese north between the Japanese imperial and the Chinese republican governments. Tensions was exploded into full battle between the two countries in 1936 over a minor incident along the northern border. Using this incident as an excuse, the Japanese invaded with full force into China by the army from the north and by the navy from the east coast. In short order, the Japanese overran the major cities of the Chinese coast, bombing the civilian population in Shanghai and worse, raping and pillaging the Chinese in their capital city of Nanking, or today Nanjing. But the Chinese government simply retreated into the huge Chinese interior, from there to conduct an ongoing resistance movement against their Japanese occupiers. Thus, World War II in the Eastern Asian theater had begun as the first chapter in this very bloody story. Yet America, though deeply shocked by the stories of the Japanese atrocities committed against the Chinese, chose to look away rather than get involved. But developments in Europe and an alliance between the Japanese and Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy would eventually change that American stance dramatically. Europe moves closer to another war. The logic of Chamberlain's appeasement policy soon developed a life of its own, especially as Churchill continued to challenge Chamberlain concerning the grave Nazi danger. Churchill, once an avid anti-communist was taking the view, in the press and on the radio as well as in parliamentary debates, that with Hitler's rise to power in Germany, the Nazis were quickly becoming the greater threat to England's security. Promises that each of Chamberlain's many concessions to Germany would be the last were constantly broken by Hitler, with each retreat by Chamberlain rationalized as necessary steps in pacifying Hitler. Actually, each retreat only made the dictator more greedy for German expansion. Sadly, Chamberlain, like Baldwin, talked himself into believing that what he was doing was protecting, rather than undermining, the peace of Europe. The German Anschluss with Austria, March of 1938. One of Hitler's major political goals was uniting German-speaking Austria with his German Nazi Reich, a move that was forbidden by the treaties of 1919. He brought both his cabinet and his military in line with his policy, replacing leaders in both, and then pressuring the Austrian government to install more Nazis in their cabinet. Meanwhile, he began pressuring Chamberlain's government to allow the unification of Germany and Austria, in theory as part of a stronger defense against communist expansion in East Europe. When Chamberlain seemed to be yielding, British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden resigned. But Austrian Prime Minister Schuschnigg refused to yield, finally arranging to have the Austrians determine the matter themselves with a national plebiscite. But 2 days before the scheduled election, Hitler threatened to send his troops into Germany if Schuschnigg did not resign, which he did, and have him replaced by the Austrian Nazi leader Seyss-Inquart, March 12, 1938. Then Seyss-Inquart in turn invited the Nazis, already moving across the border at this point, to take over Austria to restore order. A month later, a highly manipulated national plebiscite was held in Austria, producing the highly unlikely result of a 99.7% approval of the Anschluss, or enclosure, of the two countries into a single Germany. The reaction of the enforcing powers of the treaties forbidding such a union, principally Britain and France, was weak in the extreme. Chamberlain, sensing the dangers of such further expansion into other German areas around Hitler's Reich, principally Czechoslovakia and Poland, did nothing, but did promise that he would support Germany's neighbors against any further expansion by Hitler and his Nazis. Hitler overruns Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain would have the opportunity soon enough to make good on his promise and once again back down in the face of Hitler's aggressive moves. Hitler now set his eyes on the Germans living in the mountainous borderlands of Czechoslovakia, the region known as Sudetenland. Hitler began to claim loudly that the Czechs were mistreating the Germans of the Sudetenland, which was totally untrue, and he was thus forced to have to deal with the situation. However, Czechoslovakia's military defenses, aimed primarily against Germany, were well dug in there, and along with Czechoslovakia's battle-ready 40 divisions, would have offered Hitler very effective resistance to an embarrassed Hitler. To avoid mounting international crisis, Chamberlain agreed to meet in September 1938 with Hitler and Mussolini in Munich to seek a peaceful resolution to this non-crisis, not knowing that officers in the German High Command were secretly making plans to depose Hitler before he dragged the country into an unwanted war. As a result of the discussions held in Munich concerning this Czechoslovakian crisis, to which the Czechoslovakian leadership itself was not even invited, Chamberlain was pleased to offer the world a peaceful solution, one that would avoid dragging Europe into another war. Hitler would be allowed to take over the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia's mountain border defenses, with Hitler's promise that this was all of Czechoslovakia that he wanted. So happy was the European world, except the outraged Czechs, whose beloved president resigned rather than agree to the terms forced on this country, that Chamberlain had saved Europe from another war, the talk grew even of awarding him the Nobel Peace Prize. It also forced the German High Command to cancel its proposed removal of Hitler, as Hitler's acquisition of Sudetenland again made him the hero of Germany. But, of course, Hitler had no intention of keeping such a promise, and in March of 1939, again, at the invitation of Czechoslovakia's leadership, that is, the browbeaten President Hacha, Hitler sent his troops to take over all of Czechoslovakia. The world was shocked, but again did nothing. Chamberlain again repeated his promise that he would protect Germany's neighbors, Poland the next obvious target, with a declaration of war against Germany if Hitler were to make such a move. But by this time, few believed that Chamberlain would, or even could, deliver in a meaningful way on such a threat. Roosevelt turns his attention to foreign affairs. Meanwhile, with the slowing down of his New Deal programming in the latter part of the 1930s, Roosevelt had already begun to turn his attentions increasingly to foreign events in Europe and Asia. He found himself deeply concerned about the disturbing news related to the behavior of Germany in Europe and Japan in East Asia. Dark war clouds were gathering, but in America it seemed that the only person concerned about this was Roosevelt. Congress was suspicious of the dominating will of Roosevelt, especially as it seemed that he wanted America to join in addressing the growing war problems in Europe and Asia. That simply was not going to happen. Americans were still bitter about their unnecessary and costly involvement in the Great War. An extensive congressional investigation by the Senate's Nye Committee had just concluded that the only reason why America had become involved in the Great War in 1917 was to enrich the capitalist owners of industries manufacturing war goods. Daddy Warbucks, as one cartoon characterization of such a capitalist was called. Americans were not about to be dragged into another war just to benefit a small group of war profiteers at the cost of the lives of young American soldiers. Congressmen made that point very clear. Congress thus repeatedly passed neutrality acts, 1935, 1936, 1937, and 1939, all designed to ensure that Roosevelt understood Congress on this matter. Roosevelt's hands were thus tied. There was very little he could do to ready America for what most assuredly lay ahead for the nation.